Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Daca, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals in the United States, which specifically refers to dreamers. Those are children of those who came into the United States, many of them, of course, illegally, if we're using specifically the laws of the United States. They came over the borders. Now, of course, those children did not choose to come over themselves. And this has been an issue for many, many years in the U.S., where even under President Obama, then we had Daca passed to be able to protect those people who are in the U.S. Some of them are now 40 years of age and have contributed, of course, to U.S. society. They have degrees. They're contributing members of society. They pay taxes, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot, of course, that ties them to the United States as well. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court has maintained the legal status of those estimated 700,000 people whose undocumented families had brought them into the U.S. But will this last? Because it seems that when it comes to the process that was used by the White House to try to get Daca repealed or completely rescinded, that seems to have been the issue. So even a conservative Supreme Court judge did not side with the Trump administration, though he was expected to, of course, by Donald Trump himself, because the process was not followed. So will we be back to square one very soon, possibly within Donald Trump's second term, if he does win at the end of this year? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Evan Stone, who is a co-founder and co-CEO of Educators for Excellence, which is a teacher-led advocacy organization with nearly 35,000 members. He's joining us this morning from New York. Joining us from Barrington, Rhode Island, is Peter Margulies, who is teaches immigration law at Roger Williams University School of Law. He's directed the law school's immigration clinic and has also written legal briefs for the U.S. Supreme Court in immigration cases. Peter and Evan, thank you both for your time this morning. Peter, let me start with you. How important is this decision? Everyone keeps saying this is just a temporary fix at this time.
It's a very important decision for the 700,000 people who currently have benefits under DACA. Those people got a reprieve from deportation from the United States. They also got the opportunity to apply for work authorization. So DACA, as you indicated, changed lives. It allowed people to pursue an education, get a job, become productive members of American society, as Chief Justice Roberts said in his opinion. Chief Roberts also gave the administration a roadmap to get their reasoning right, to explain more clearly why they felt it was important to cancel the program and to consider whether they needed to do anything to avoid disrupting the lives of those people who have benefited so much since DACA was enacted in 2012. The administration still has the opportunity to do that, but I do think as a practical matter, it would be very difficult to start a whole new attempt to halt DACA before the November election.
Evan, I wonder for yourself as somebody who works in education, why is this important? Why is it important to preserve DACA and then to ideally have more of a permanent fix for this issue?
First, thank you for having me on, and I would agree with Peter. This is a momentous decision for the nearly 700,000 or up to 800,000, depending on which numbers you're looking at, dreamers in the country. For us, it's important because these are contributing members of our society. They are teachers, they are nurses, and they are students. We regularly hear from teachers who teach documented students or who are documented themselves saying, I no longer have to live in fear. Day in and day out, they were worried that this decision would come down and they would be deported from the country. The country, many of them have known for their entire life that they are an active member of our society. And so, building on what Peter said, it's not an opportunity for them to go to school now. Many of them have been through college, gotten degrees, and are working in all of our systems and in our country, and are critical to our ongoing success. So for us, it is a huge moment for the safety, the security, and the mental health of our students, teachers, nurses that are documented, particularly at a time in our country where we need them.
Peter, I imagine the other side would say, listen, the U.S. is a country of law and order, and we need to figure out a way, or we need to deal with the fact that these people did come into the country undocumented, as in their parents came in certainly undocumented and probably in an illegal fashion. That needs to be dealt with according to the laws of the U.S. And I imagine for any country, if we were to stretch it for any country around the world, that sort of creates this confusion, doesn't it, about how does one then make all of these people legal, even though they came in illegally?
You're absolutely right. And Justice Clarence Thomas, in his dissent, made a powerful case that DACA was not consistent with the overall framework of our immigration law. The United States immigration law is generous, but it also is strict in certain ways. It allows only certain people in the country based on family relationships, close family relationships, and employment skills, and also refugees and a handful of other people. Unfortunately for DACA recipients, they don't fall into any of those categories. And so usually they would be at least eligible for deportation from the United States. And a larger program that President Obama tried to start, the DAPA program, Deferred Action for Parents of Americans, which would have affected about 4 million people, was halted by the courts and never really got started, never got off its feet. Justice Thomas compared DAPA to DACA. He said they were the same kind of problem for immigration law. And it's certainly true that Congress does need to do something to help both DACA recipients and other people who are here without a actual documented status. And that probably is somewhere around 11 million people right now who need to be regularized so that they have a status that is normal, they can go about their lives, they can also become contributing members of American society. Even Justice Kavanaugh, who also dissented from the ruling earlier in the week, said that Congress had to act.
Evan, I'm just going to play advocate for a moment. The argument can be made, we don't want to reward people for coming in illegally, right? How does one avoid that?
So I don't think this is about reward or penalize. This is about justice in many ways. These are young people who have been in this country, who have gone to our schools, and I agree that Congress now needs to act because this is a temporary solution. They are paying taxes, they are working, they do not have criminal records. These are the best of America in many ways, and we should be doing everything we can to keep them in our country, to keep them contributing, and to not break up families who have been living here, in many cases, for decades. So from our perspective and from tens of thousands of educators across the country, our next step is to put pressure on Congress to say we need a permanent solution. America overwhelmingly, polling shows us, supports a permanent solution for Dreamers to keep them in our country because they're a part of our country.
Indeed, and that poll that you've referred to, Evan, believe it says 74%, according to the Pew Research Institute survey that I saw just released last week, support granting, permanent legal status to children brought into the U.S., i.e. Dreamers. Peter, I wonder if an administration like Donald Trump is actually willing to go the extra mile to actually deal with this properly, right? Because the fear is that, A, he'll try to get DACA repealed within his second term. Do you think that that is likely to go through? And then that would just, I imagine, dash hopes of a permanent solution for both DACA and DAPA as well, as you had alluded to earlier?
Yes, I think that's right. I think if President Trump is reelected, he will definitely try to follow through and stop this program. He's made some noises about a comprehensive immigration solution, but I don't believe that his administration has the structure or the will to work with Congress for that solution. And he would require Congress to do things that Congress rightly shouldn't do, like make it very difficult for close family members to come to this country legally. Unfortunately, one thing President Trump wants to do, and he said this, as does his advisor Stephen Miller, is to limit legal immigration to the United States, including those family members who can come here under the law right now. That would be a disaster for U.S. immigration. Congress will not go along with that. And that's why I think a deal with President Trump and Congress will be very difficult. That's why people really care about this issue should consider moving their support to Vice President Biden. I'm not endorsing any presidential candidate here, but it is absolutely clear that Vice President Biden, as president, would work with Congress in a more productive way on immigration issues.
On that point, then, Evan, what kind of conversations do you have and your organization have with those on the other side, right? Because I imagine there needs to be a conversation, right, where those who are very opposed to the likes of DACA, they need to be, I guess, shown the logic of why it is important? I mean, do you see yourself and your organization, are you being able to get through to them?
We have seen a growing support across the country on both sides of the aisle for Republicans and Democrats of support of Dreamers. So the Pew Research poll you cited is a great example, and that has been a steadily increasing number over the last 4 or 5 years of this conversation. It was certainly much more controversial when the Daca program was launched in President Obama's administration. And I think that's because people now are understanding who our Dreamers are, that these were young people who came to this country, many of them with their families, many of them not based on their own decision. Although they do not have formal documentation, they have gone to our schools, they are a part of our culture, they work in our, there are hundreds and hundreds of documented teachers that are teaching our young people right now. There are documented nurses who are working in our hospitals during our COVID pandemic. And so these are a part of every state in our country. People know them in their neighborhoods and have relationships with them. And so what we've seen is the best force of advocacy is Dreamers themselves. When they are now have a little more safety behind them, now the Supreme Court ruling has happened, they can be much more public, speaking about their own stories and who they are. And I do think that they are having an impact. This is broadly supported. And I agree with Peter that it will be difficult to accomplish a solution with President Trump. But I do think there are Republicans in both the House and the Senate that also want to find a permanent solution for Dreamers.
All right, so Peter, I'll give you the final word. I was looking at the numbers, right, about how much Dreamers actually contribute to American society, just in dollar terms. And I know it's not fair to always look at contributions in that sense, but that's important, isn't it, especially in an era of a pandemic and a slowing economy, even in the U.S. So I was reading that abruptly revoking Dreamers' work permits, and I'm going to quote now, could result in the loss of $215 billion in economic activity and an associated $60 billion in federal tax revenue over the next 10 years. Now, just on that point, for a president who wants the economy to do well, who's kind of obsessed with it, if we're completely honest, I'm trying to see the logic on his part of why he would still want to go ahead with this.
Unfortunately, President Trump cares more about his base, which is fearful of the United States changing because it becomes a country that has comparatively fewer white people and more of a kind of rich panoply of people of all races, nationalities, and creeds. That, I think, definitely benefits America. And you also have a substantial economic benefit, as you pointed out. So a rational president would see that and would work to make sure that people can remain here as productive members of our society. But unfortunately for President Trump, catering to his base is more important. That's why I don't think we'll make true progress on immigration law unless we get a different president.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that. But of course, we appreciate Peter and Evan for their time this morning. Evan, they're speaking to us from New York, and Peter was speaking to us from Barrington, Rhode Island. We'll try to give you an understanding, a better understanding, I should say, of Daca and how important it is. It's not just about the economics of all of this, right? But those are still important numbers, certainly. And 74% support on the part of Americans for these Dreamers to now have a permanent solution. Remember, Daca itself is not a permanent solution. It's a temporary fix, which allows these people to remain in the country till a permanent fix is found through the Congress, as both of our guests there spoke about. Will Congress act? Can Donald Trump be the president under whom this is resolved, or will he go ahead, as he has so said he will, to ensure that Daca is in fact repealed and these people are then either sent back or their work permits, etc., are revoked, thus then losing out, on their contributions to society and then creating chaos with having all these people leaving, even though they came into the country of no choice of their own, because their parents' choices. Now, we can, of course, argue whether their parents' choices were good or bad, but that's a debate for another day and another time. I'll leave it there for now. I'll be back after this break with my next segment. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Schedule 7 in the UK, which is an airport stop and search essentially, it gives permission for stop and search by airport authorities and counter-terror officers at airports across the UK. And an ex-counterterrorism officer in the UK called Kevin Maxwell has written a book in which he claims that a lot of these Schedule 7 stops are faked, or that they come into the database because a certain target of a number of targets has to be reached on a certain day. Now, he's worked at the likes of Heathrow, which we know is one of the busiest airports in the world, but even Schedule 7 in and of itself has had concerns from the moment it was brought forth, with concerns about, of course, profiling against Arabs, Muslims, etc. There are also concerns about just overall how BAME passengers entering into the UK are treated, and whether or not, just because of their landing cards, they're being mistakenly or purposefully placed onto even terrorism databases, which can, of course, have a domino effect on whenever they travel again. That's something that Kevin brings up in his book, as well as the subsequent interviews as well. Now, he's not the only one who's brought this up as a concern. We've had other counter-terror officers or ex-counter-terror officers who have also spoken about this. And another one was a woman named Barbara Linford, who had won a discrimination suit against the Sussex police in 2007. She had also alleged in court that her colleagues at Gatwick, which is another one of the major airports in London, routinely faked counter-terrorism patrol reports. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Tetteh Kofi, who is a broadcaster and journalist. He's also been a consultant to corporate institutions on the management of diversity. He's joining us from London. Joining us from Liverpool is David Lowe, who is a senior research fellow at Leeds Beckett University Law School. He also researches terrorism and security, policing and criminal law. He's the author of Terrorism, Law and Policy. David and Tetteh, thank you both for your time today. David, let me start with you. How concerning would it be for any counterterrorism officers at an airport such as Heathrow or Gatwick to be essentially faking those who they're entering into the database?
Look at the timescales, and you look at when the book was written, when they were serving, and you look at the developments now, because 2013 was a watershed moment. We have the David Miranda case that was linked to Glenn Greenwald and Edward Snowden. Glenn Greenwald was the journalist who was dealing with Edward Snowden, and David Miranda was returning back to Brazil via Heathrow, and he was stopped under Schedule 7. There's been other developments. There was the Sylvia Bagel case, also looked at issues. So they looked at issues of detention, period of detention. They looked at lack of access to a legal representative, because in essence, as you said, it is controversial, Waqar. There's no reasonable suspicion needed by the police. You must answer the questions. There's no right to silence. You must pass over passwords and so on for electronic devices. But there were changes from that, and there were changes to Schedule 7. It has been controversial, but I think if you're looking at the period where there were targets, I think those targets now have gone. They've taken them away. And yes, it was initially looking at, as you said, targeted flights. I mean, I remember one of my PhD students was returning from Pakistan. He killed two birds with one stone. He saw his family and was doing some research, and he was stopped. And it was quite a terrible time for him during that period. And I, in fact, got a phone call from the police on that. So it has been controversial, but it has also been used on other targets. Very recently, Paul Golding, the leading of the far-right group, Britain First, he was stopped on a flight from Moscow, and he refused to give his passwords, and he was prosecuted for under the Terrorism Act. So it has developed from 2013, and it's developed in a positive way, but it'll still remain a controversial pile because no reasonable suspicion needed. Normally, there's no legal representation for the first hour because of logistics, really, halting an interview that could be over and done within half an hour, and having to no right to silence. So it will remain controversial.
Yeah. Tetteh, what are your thoughts about this? Because again, this brings up many issues, right? Just about profiling, as I said, and even Kevin in his book writes things like, somebody told him that somebody was stopped or was added onto the database because, quote unquote, he looked like Osama bin Laden. I mean, these are really odd things and really disturbing things for any counterterrorism officer to be saying, right?
See, the first thing that comes to mind is that using stereotypes is the laziest way of investigating any situation. And if, as a result of stereotypes applied to a person on account of race or where they come from, we hoover up all this information, which has two impacts. The first being that the person who whose data has been captured receives a draconian loss of their rights in the moment. And as in the case of Robinson, it affects them going further down the line. But the second thing is you often get the wrong information on your databases, so that the real people who are of real concern actually wriggle away. So eternally, this idea of lazy detective work using stereotypes continues to haunt us. Actually, the difficulty is that when people are given targets, they will always go to the most vulnerable people first. If they have targets to achieve, they will go to the people who don't have the connections and the networks to hurt the institution by damaging their reputation. So it will always be the weakest people who will put on these targets, and very often they just simply are not the villains that we're actually trying to catch.
You know, David, I take your point earlier about how changes have been made recently when it comes to Schedule 7 and how it's used. But I wonder, for those who may have been placed on terrorism databases or other criminal databases as well, do you think that the government is going back retroactively and looking at each of those names case by case? I mean, that would make sense to do, right? Because all of this has a domino effect, as I said, for whenever a person wants to travel again, and when they reach any respective airport in the UK or even around the world. I imagine this information is shared with other countries. This would create many problems for them.
Yeah, I mean, also in my previous life, before an academic, I was a police officer involved in counterterrorism. And that concerns me, and I agree, there's nothing worse than lazy investigations and stereotyping. And I think it would be absolutely important if they've got the names, the details, to go through, and those who were just added and weren't even stopped, I think is an absolute disgrace. And I think it reflects poorly on the professionalism of the UK police, because you look at how they deal with counter-terrorism overall, most of the time it's dealt with very professionally. But Schedule 7, I think in its early days, was a power that most people weren't aware of. And I think they were setting targets. I think having to remove setting targets in the numbers that they've got, I'd rather use the term target. It's a very useful power on certain targets, individuals who are suspected, looking at passenger name record data, airline passenger information, trying to join up dots if there are individuals who are flying or coming into the UK through seaports, looking at those and look at targets. Spend your time on that. Just don't start, as you said, stereotyping is the worst thing you can do. Obviously, there's limited resources, so there'll be certain flights, for example, that would be targeted. And certainly at the height of Islamic State, it was, I know a lot of flights to Turkey from the UK were targeted, because that's how those who joined Islamic State from the UK, they would go to Turkey, arrive at Istanbul, travel down to Gaziantep, and go across the border. So that's right to do that. But and I totally agree, don't stereotype, don't be lazy. I think it's just, it's like we're discussing now. It tarnishes that reputation, the professionalism of the UK police.
You know, Tetteh, I also wonder, whenever we have such policies, right, like Schedule 7 or even, Prevent, and we can talk about that, of course, within the country also, but this otherizes communities, right, within the UK who, in fact, would probably be quite willing to work with the government to keep the entire country safe if they were to see something that they were uncomfortable with and that was untoward and they felt was risky. But I imagine when you otherize the other, then you sort of put them off, right, from cooperating with authorities?
That's extraordinary. That's a question I would have wanted you to ask me, because we now segue into the arena of institutionalized racism. The people who are making these laws and using these processes have no idea what it feels to be at the butt end of those processes. And because of that, their sense of awareness of the personal impact on those communities is, I would say, almost zero. If you look through the United Kingdom, most white people have no idea what the immigration rules of this country actually are, until a relation gets involved with somebody from Africa, the Caribbean, Asia, or this, that, the other. They want to settle down. all of a sudden, the number of people who said to me, wow, are those really the laws that govern us regarding immigration in the United Kingdom? So this is what happens. Now, because they don't have this sense of awareness, they have no idea how excluding this is. They don't understand that because these things happen to people who may look like me or like you, Waqar, that the sense of existential threat that arises almost precludes the possibility of working with the host body, our parent society, as a valid and supportive member. They are repeatedly shooting themselves in the foot. Here's a funny thing. Yeah. People who come from these cultures that are being targeted are usually actually far more law and order conscious than people in the West. They are people who are used to being told that this is the law and they will more or less follow it. This has been my experience and my observation. And so by actually alienating them this way, you are looking at people who have a huge percentage, not only culturally, but also personally, in the support and the stasis and the cohesion of society. It's an own goal.
David, what are your thoughts on that? Because I imagine that's a huge factor in all this, right? I mean, in your experience from when you were working in counterterrorism directly, it's important, isn't it, to have the community on board, all communities on board, because as I said, I mean, the vast majority of British Muslims would want Britain to remain safe from terror attacks because that endangers them and their loved ones as well. So, I mean, why not bring the communities in instead of having this sort of profiling?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there, Waqar. You mentioned prevent before. We won't go down that path, but that is the police involvement is more on a community policing basis. That had its problems initially. It only dealt with violent Islamist ideology, and that didn't help. And certainly, this looks at the period where we're looking at where these reports are from. This period prior to 2012, 2013. Prevent now looks at all forms of extremism. And I think we're also one fortunate thing, I suppose, we could look at is our current Home Secretary is not only female, but she's of an Asian background. In fact, in the House of Commons the other day, she made that point very clear to opposition MPs, how she suffered racial abuse through her childhood and onwards as an adult. So one good thing is maybe we are having some senior politicians who are looking at this. Of course, she's been heavily criticised over the immigration laws that she wants to bring in. But it is that thing of we've got to work with communities, and I think it's all communities. And unfortunately, the UK is also recognising the threat from the extreme far right and the far right, the extreme far right being the neo-Nazis. And it's good to see that they're being targeted as well, because we all want to be safe. We are a multicultural society in the UK. We've got to work at living together. I always find the more you look for differences, the more you find similarities. And it is about just getting on and living as one community. And we have extremists on either side, and they're the ones we need to deal with. So for the police, focus that attention on those who are causing the problem in relation to security, and not, as Tobias was saying, not have that lazy stereotype style of investigation.
Tetteh, do you think that things are moving in a positive direction? Because it seems that the worldwide momentum, right, not just in the UK, but in the US and everywhere, is to move in a direction where we're now in a more inclusive societies, more diverse societies, right, where we're accepting that fact, A, and secondly, we want to move towards including everybody in the fore, as we would say. Do you think that the UK is moving in that direction as well?
Well, it depends which part of the UK you're looking at. Actually, historically, the UK has been incredibly good at knowing what her enemies think. That's why the UK has done rather better at protecting herself from terror than many other European post-colonial, former colonial powers as targets. The UK has been very good at it. But something has happened. A political narrative has been used to gain power. And that political narrative involves demonizing foreigners. However, on May 25th, that policeman who put his knee on that black man's neck for 9 minutes seems to have been a cataclysmic game changer. If you had asked me on the 24th of May that it was possible for 50 countries to have demonstrations about Black Lives Mattering, I would have said to you, in your dreams. The only people who haven't got involved in Black Lives Matter are the people on Antarctica, and most of them are penguins. So there has been a dramatic change in the popular narrative. And I think that the challenge is the leadership of our societies are struggling to catch up with what the young people are saying, because they are mostly young, these demonstrators. And I think they're looking around and saying, actually, do you know what? I don't want to live with the shame and guilt of what's going on anymore. The previous generation has become acculturated to carrying that burden of shame and guilt. And it's always dealt with it by denial, sweep it under the carpet, pretend it's not happening, because it's not happening to them. But now I think that particular rabbit is out of the box, is out of the hat, and it won't be put back.
All right, David, I'll give you the final word before both go. You've mentioned that we're moving in a positive direction when it comes to these things. Do you think that a lot of the momentum now with these Black Lives Matter protests, even in the UK, that will now bring in or usher in an era where there'll be more understanding, right, of those on the receiving end of these policies as well?
Yeah, I ideally hope so. I mean, we talk about suspect communities. I remember the Irish Troubles, and Irish Catholics and British-born Catholics with an Irish background like me were part of the suspect community. And it is quite hard when you're stopped at ports and asked why you're travelling and where you're going. So I've been through that on that side as well as on the policing side. So I understand that is an issue. But I think there are plenty of good things that can come out of these demonstrations. And of course, perhaps I would add that that incident was in Minnesota. And one sad part is they're looking at UK policing, which is a completely different setup to the US. I mean, I obviously haven't got the time to go on, but I've done a lot of work on hate crime and terrorism in the US, and it's completely different legal structure to what we see in the UK. But I'm always optimistic, Waqar. I'm always one that we can live together. There'll always be some individuals who have an extremist view, either from whichever side they're coming from. But most of the time, we want to live together in peace and harmony and get on with our lives. And I think that's the important part.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that. But of course, we appreciate both David and Tetteh for their time today and, of course, for their insight. It is concerning, of course, when you read Kevin Maxwell's books and his statements about exactly what happened during his experience as a former counterterrorism officer at the likes of Heathrow. And Heathrow is, of course, an extremely busy airport there in the UK, the main airport, really, of London. And then, of course, we've also heard about experiences coming out of Gatwick as well, where a former officer there, too, said essentially Schedule 7 databases were essentially faked, where you were looking at landing cards and you had to meet certain targets and you put in names pretty much on a whim, as well as targeted people, basically profiling them based on their names and, again, how they looked. And all of the above, of course, does not mean that you're keeping the country safe, because if you're actually looking at the numbers, according to CAGE, which is an advocacy group, the numbers simply don't add up to make all of this worth it, to create this otherization of other people and communities, be they Muslim, Black, or Asian of other sorts. You're basically otherizing them and turning them off from cooperating with authorities on issues which they would, in fact, find dangerous and risky for the rest of the country. They probably will not then approach authorities, even though David, though, mentioned now things have become better, and certainly they have, according to all reports. Is it enough, though? Have enough lessons been learned? And will those lessons be enforced now going forward? I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.